The garbage bag split open on the porch steps, and Elena's clothes spilled out across the wet concrete in the rain. A green sweater, a pair of scrubs, the good boots she'd bought herself for her 40th birthday. And I stood in the doorway looking down at all of it without any particular feeling at all, which scared me more than rage would have. My name is Marcus. I'm 40. I run a small general contracting business here in Knoxville. And that night, I'd just thrown 4 garbage bags of my wife's belongings out onto our own front porch in the rain for the second time in 5 months because she'd promised me, again, that it was over, and I'd found, again, that it wasn't. Elena is 36. She's an ER nurse, 12 years in, the kind of person strangers trust immediately with their worst moments, because something in her voice tells you she's not going to panic no matter what walks through those doors. We've been married 10 years. We have 2 kids, Julia, 8, who inherited her mother's steadiness, and Nate, 5, who still asked, that whole terrible year, why mommy sometimes slept on the couch. I want to tell you this started with one discovery, one confrontation, one clean line between before and after. It didn't. This is a story about 4 separate endings, each one real while it lasted, each one collapsing within days, and about what it costs a man to keep believing his wife when some part of him has already stopped. The first time I found out about Ray, it was February, and it came from an unremarkable place. A text preview on a shared tablet the kids used for homework, still logged into Elena's account from months earlier out of pure household forgetfulness. For words on a lock screen. I didn't even need to open it. I knew, the way you know a structure's compromised from the sound of a single creak in the right place. I confronted her that same night. She cried, said it had been going on 8 months, said it was over as of that exact conversation, that she'd already been trying to find a way to tell me. I believed her. I wanted to believe her the way a man wants solid ground under a house he's already poured the foundation for. It lasted 6 days. What I didn't understand yet, what would take me the better part of a year and 3 more collapses to finally accept, was that Elena wasn't lying to me those 6 days. She meant it, completely, every time she said it was over. She just couldn't make it stay that way, and neither of us had any idea, that February night on the porch with rain coming down on her scattered clothes, that we were only at the beginning of a cycle that would break something in both of us long before it finally ended for good. I remember standing in the doorway afterward, once she'd gathered everything back up off the wet concrete, and asked, quietly, if she could bring it back inside. I remember saying yes. I remember thinking, even then, some small cold part of me registering the strangeness of the scene. A woman gathering her own thrown-out clothes back into a house she still, technically, lived in, and not yet understanding that this exact tableau, gathering and throwing, would repeat itself with variations I couldn't yet imagine. 15 years earlier, when Elena and I met, she was finishing nursing school, and I was 3 years into building my own crew from nothing, and the thing that drew me to her, more than anything else, was how completely present she was in every room she occupied. She'd remember a stranger's coffee order after one meeting. She'd notice, before I did, when my mother was having a hard week. That presence, that specific gift of hers, was the exact thing I'd stopped receiving somewhere in the last 2 or 3 years of our marriage, buried under night shifts and my own long days in a house that ran on logistics instead of attention. I didn't know that yet, standing in that doorway in February. I only knew my wife had cheated on me, and that she said it was over, and that I badly wanted to believe her. I want to describe what the months between endings actually looked like, because that's the part people don't understand about a relapse pattern like this. It wasn't constant crisis. It was long stretches of something that looked, convincingly, like recovery. After that first February confrontation, Elena did everything a person is supposed to do. She offered up her phone unprompted, set it on the counter screen up the way she used to years earlier. She came home on time, texted if a shift ran long, texted again when she actually left the building. She started therapy. Actual, weekly therapy, not a performance of it. An hour every Tuesday with a woman named Dr. Alba, whose name I only learned because Elena mentioned her, unprompted, at dinner, the way you mention someone you've started to trust. For close to 2 months, our house felt like it was healing in the plain, unglamorous way houses actually heal, one ordinary dinner at a time. We started eating together more, all 4 of us, something that had quietly stopped happening somewhere in the 2 years before any of this. Julia noticed. she said, one night in March. We do dinner like this now. Not as a complaint, just an observation. The specific, unfiltered kind 8-year-olds make that lands harder on the adults in the room than the child intends. I want to be honest about my own part in what came before all this, because I wasn't blindsided by nothing. Elena worked 12-hour shifts, rotating nights, while I ran my crews 6 days a week and came home too tired most nights to do more than eat and collapse in front of the television with the sound too low to actually follow. We'd been living, for at least 2 years before Ray, like coworkers who shared a mortgage, passing each other in the kitchen, trading kid logistics through a shared calendar app rather than actual conversation, rarely talking about anything underneath the schedule itself. I had a temper I managed by staying busy rather than by ever really discussing what was bothering me, a pattern I'd learned from my own father, who fixed trucks in the garage for 6 hours rather than say one uncomfortable sentence to my mother. Somewhere in those 2 quiet years, Elena had apparently found, in a paramedic who worked her same brutal hours, someone who was simply there in a way I mostly wasn't. None of that excuses what happened. I want to say that clearly, because I spent a long time in this story blaming myself more than I should have, right alongside blaming her exactly as much as I needed to. Both things can be true. I'll come back to that. By April, 2 months after the first ending, small things had started reappearing that I initially explained away as nothing. Elena had switched back to keeping her phone face down, a habit I'd noticed her drop entirely during the good stretch, and now watched quietly return, one Tuesday, without either of us saying anything about it. She started taking slightly longer routes home from certain shifts. Nothing dramatic, 20 extra minutes, always attached to a plausible reason. Traffic on Kingston Pike, a coworker needing a ride to their car in the overflow lot. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a man who'd just been betrayed once was always going to see ghosts in ordinary shadows for a while. That hypervigilance was its own kind of damage I needed to manage in myself. I didn't ask her directly. I told myself I was giving her room to rebuild trust rather than smothering her with suspicion, which felt, at the time, like generosity. Looking back, it was also fear. Fear that asking too soon might create the very outcome I was afraid of, might push at a door I was desperately hoping stayed shut on its own. There was a specific evening in early April I've thought about more than most others from that stretch. Elena came home from a shift close to 11, later than her text had said, and when I asked, lightly, what had run long, she gave me an answer about a trauma case that had backed up the whole department. Plausible, detailed, the kind of story an ER nurse tells easily, because her whole day is made of exactly that kind of story. I believed it completely. I found out, months later, it hadn't been true at all. The second signal came from Julia, the way the deepest ones in this whole story kept coming from a child too young to understand what she was actually reporting. She mentioned, at breakfast one Saturday, that Mommy had been on the phone in the car in the school pickup line for a long time, with her serious voice, and that she hadn't seen who it was because Mommy had turned around. I asked, casually, who it might have been. Elena, at the stove, said it was probably work, one of the newer nurses asking about scheduling. I let it go. I told myself Julia's sense of a long time was an 8-year-old's sense of time, elastic and unreliable. I didn't consider, that morning, that it might be exactly as long as it felt to her. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever watched someone you love fight the same battle over and over, losing a little more each time, and felt your own hope for them thinning out even as you kept showing up anyway, you understand exactly what that spring felt like for me. The second ending came in late April, 10 weeks after the first, and it came from Elena herself this time, unprompted, in a way that genuinely surprised me. She sat me down one evening after the kids were asleep and told me, crying, that she'd let herself text Ray twice that week, that nothing physical had happened, but that she needed to tell me before it became something worse, because she could feel herself sliding. I appreciated the honesty. I want to be fair to her about that. This wasn't a woman lying easily. It was a woman genuinely trying, and genuinely failing, to hold a line she desperately wanted to hold. She told me, that night, that Dr. Alba had helped her understand something about the specific hours she was most vulnerable. The drive home after a bad trauma case. The exact window where the adrenaline finally drained out of her body and left something raw and unguarded behind it. And that Ray, working those same brutal hours, had simply been in that window with her more often than I ever was. I didn't know it then. This is what Elena was living through during that same stretch in April, in the days before she came to me. I told myself texting him wasn't the same as what happened before, that I could keep it small enough to be harmless. I remember standing in the hospital parking garage after a shift that had gone sideways. A kid, a bad outcome. The kind of night that hollows you out completely. And Ray was the person who called to check on me, not because I'd asked him to, but because he already knew my schedule well enough to know that shift would break something in me. Marcus was asleep by the time I got home that night, the way he usually was. I told myself needing someone who was actually awake and actually present didn't count as betrayal if I kept it to words on a screen. I believed that story for exactly as long as it took to stop being true. By the second text, I already knew where it was heading. I told myself I'd stop before it got there. I was wrong about that in a way I'm still ashamed of. That's what she told me, months later. That April, I only knew she'd come to me crying, and I chose to see the honesty in it rather than the pattern underneath it. I told her I forgave her, that the honesty mattered, that we'd keep working on it. We went to a couples session together for the first time that week, sitting in Dr. Alba's small office with its two identical armchairs and a box of tissues positioned exactly between us, which struck me, even in the moment, as almost too on the nose to be real. I remember feeling, driving home afterward, something like hope. Fragile, but real, the specific kind of hope you build after a bad diagnosis when the doctor says the treatment is working. That version lasted 5 days before I found out, through an offhand comment from a coworker of hers I ran into at the hardware store. A woman named Priya, who worked triage alongside Elena and clearly had no idea she was handing me anything significant. That Elena and Ray had eaten lunch together twice that same week, in person, not just texting. Priya mentioned it the way you mention any small, unremarkable office detail, laughing about how the cafeteria line moved faster when Elena and Ray went early together to beat the crowd. I stood in the paint aisle holding a 5-gallon bucket of primer and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. The third cycle is the one where I stopped being purely reactive and started, without fully admitting it to myself, becoming someone who watched. After the hardware store conversation, I didn't confront her immediately. I sat with it for 4 days, turning it over, telling myself I needed to be sure before I said anything. Though if I'm honest, some part of me was also just exhausted. Tired of being the man who discovers things and reacts. Wanting, for once, to know something fully before I let it detonate my own composure again. I started noticing the pattern behind the pattern. Elena's guilt, when it built, showed itself the same way each time. She'd get quieter for 2 or 3 days, over-explain small logistics that didn't need explaining, saying things like, "I'm just going to grab dinner with the team after the shift, nothing special," when nobody had asked her to account for her evening at all. She'd flinch, slightly, when her phone buzzed in a room with me in it, a half-second tightening in her shoulders. I'd started, by May, to recognize the way you recognize the specific sound your car makes right before something expensive breaks. Then, inevitably, the guilt would crest into another confession, another promise, another 6 or 7 good days, and then the quiet drift back toward whatever door she kept telling herself she'd closed for good. Julia, 8 years old and sharper than either of us gave her enough credit for, asked me one evening in May why Mommy seemed sad, in the same way she'd seemed sad a few months earlier, a comment that landed harder than almost anything else that spring, because it meant even our daughter had started, without understanding what she was tracking, noticing the rhythm of her mother's collapses. I told Julia that grown-ups get tired sometimes, that it wasn't anything for her to worry about, and I hated how easily the lie came out of me, how quickly I'd learned to manage the appearance of a stable house for the sake of an 8-year-old who deserved a true one. Nate, at 5, was too young to track any of this consciously, but he'd started asking, some nights, why Mommy slept on the couch instead of in the bed with Daddy, a habit that had crept in during the tense stretches between good weeks, when neither Elena nor I could quite manage to lie next to each other without the whole unspoken architecture of the year pressing down on both of us. I told him Mommy sometimes liked the couch better for her back. He accepted that the way 5-year-olds accept most explanations, without follow-up, which somehow made the lie feel worse rather than easier. The third ending came in June, for months after the first, and this one Elena delivered with more resolve than either of the previous two. She'd apparently told Ray herself, directly, that it needed to stop completely, that she couldn't keep doing this to her family. She showed me the actual message thread this time, the ending conversation itself, something she hadn't offered before. I read it standing in our kitchen, her words on the screen precise and final in a way that felt, for the first time since February, like something I could actually trust. I want to be honest. This happened, whatever we had. It can't keep happening. I need you to respect that and not reach out. Ray's response had been short. I understand. I'm sorry it has to be this way. Take care of yourself. I remember reading it and feeling, for the first time since February, something like real relief. Not the fragile hope of the second ending, but something closer to solid ground. We went out to dinner that weekend, just the two of us, my mother watching the kids, and I remember Elena reaching across the table and holding my hand in a way that felt, for the length of that dinner, entirely uncomplicated. It lasted 11 days, the longest stretch yet, which somehow made the fourth relapse, when it came, in late June, land harder than any of the others, because I genuinely started rebuilding something on top of that 11 days, only to feel the whole structure give out again underneath me. That was the first time I truly started to doubt not just Elena, but the entire idea that this could ever actually end through her own effort alone. I understood, standing in our kitchen after finding out about the fourth relapse from a location ping I hadn't meant to check, but couldn't stop myself from checking, that I was no longer dealing with a single betrayal I could forgive and move past. I was dealing with something closer to an addiction and addictions. I'd learned from watching my own father struggle with alcohol for years before he finally quit. Don't respond to promises. They respond, if they respond at all, to consequences severe enough to finally outweigh whatever they're feeding. I didn't confront her right away that fourth time. I sat with the location ping for 2 full days. And in those 2 days, something in me that had been operating on hope for 5 months finally, quietly, switched over to something colder and more deliberate. I chased one false lead hard during that stretch, and it cost me almost a full day I didn't need to lose. I became briefly convinced that Elena's sister, Marisol, who lived across town and had always been close with Elena, must have known about all of this from the start and been covering for her. A theory built entirely on the fact that Elena had visited Marisol more often that spring than in previous years. I called Marisol directly, feeling half sick about it, and heard, in her genuine confusion and then her genuine hurt on my behalf once I explained, that she'd had no idea any of this was happening at all. Another person entirely blindsided by something I'd assumed she was helping to hide. I apologized to her more than once. She told me, gently, that she wished I'd called her sooner, for my own sake, not because she could have told me anything, but because she could have at least been someone in my corner through it. I want to be honest about what I did during those 2 days after the fourth relapse, because it wasn't entirely admirable, even though it felt, at the time, like the only rational response left to me. I stopped confronting Elena on emotion and started documenting instead, screenshots of the location pings across all 4 cycles. Dates matched against her promises, the original text thread from February saved before she could delete it, the lunch date confirmation from Priya written down with an actual date attached, the ending conversation from June saved as proof that even a genuine, resolved ending hadn't held. I built, over those 2 days, an actual record of the pattern itself, for separate endings, for separate relapses, each cycle roughly 6 to 11 days shorter or longer than the last, a rhythm I could now see clearly laid out in a way Elena, caught inside her own guilt and self-deception each time, seemed unable to see for herself. I laid it out like a timeline on a legal pad, the way I'd lay out a project schedule for a client. February 14th, discovery, ending declared. February 20th, first relapse confirmed via secondhand information. April 22nd, second ending declared, unprompted, in person. April 27th, second relapse confirmed, hardware store conversation. June 3rd, third ending declared, message thread shown as proof. June 14th, fourth relapse confirmed, location data. 11 days. 5 days. 11 days. Looking at those numbers side by side did something to me that no single confrontation had managed. It turned a story I'd been living emotionally into a pattern I could see with the same cold clarity I'd used to spot a contractor cutting corners on a job site. I want to mention one more wrong turn during this stretch, because it matters to how thoroughly this pattern had eaten into my ability to trust my own judgment. I became briefly, intensely suspicious that Ray's own wife. I'd learned by then, through Priya, that he was married too, something Elena hadn't initially told me back in February. Might be complicit somehow, aware and tolerating it for her own reasons, maybe even orchestrating some kind of arrangement between the four of us that none of us had actually agreed to. I spent a full evening constructing a theory that felt, looking back, almost like a way to avoid the simpler, harder truth in front of me. It collapsed within a day, once I understood, through the same mutual acquaintance, that Ray's wife, a woman named Carla, had no idea any of this was happening at all. Another person entirely unaware she was standing exactly where I'd been standing 5 months earlier, going about her days believing her own marriage was simply ordinary. By the second day, I had what I needed, proof not of one betrayal, but of an entire unbroken pattern for attempts to stop that had each failed within roughly a week and a half. I understood something else too, sitting with all of it laid out on my laptop late that second night, that Elena's failures weren't really about Ray specifically anymore, if they ever fully had been. They were about a loneliness inside our marriage that predated him, one I'd contributed to as much as she had, and that even now, even fully informed, I still didn't know how to fix. That didn't change what I intended to do next. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost mechanical after 5 months of emotional whiplash, that I was no longer capable of trusting a promise from Elena, no matter how sincerely she meant it in the moment she made it. I needed something that didn't depend on her intentions at all. I remember thinking, staring at that legal pad in the lamplight of my own garage at nearly 1 in the morning, that I had spent months treating hope like a strategy, and that a man who builds houses for a living should have known better than anyone that hope isn't a foundation. It's just the feeling you get standing on one that hasn't given out yet. I confronted her on a Thursday evening, the kids at my sister's for a sleepover I'd arranged in advance, deliberately, the same way I had before. I didn't lay evidence on the table quietly this time. I want to be honest about what actually happened, because it wasn't controlled. I told her what I knew. The fourth relapse, the location pings, the full 4-cycle pattern laid out in order on that legal pad, dates and days between each collapse written out so plainly there was no room left for either of us to argue about the shape of it. I told her the numbers out loud. 6 days, 5 days, 11 days. I asked her how long she thought this one would have lasted if I hadn't found the location ping. Something in me that had been holding steady through 3 previous confrontations finally gave out completely. I didn't touch her. I want to be clear about that. But I went into our bedroom while she stood frozen in the doorway, and I pulled her clothes out of the closet, armful after armful, and carried them out to the front porch in the rain that had started an hour earlier. And I threw them down onto the wet concrete without saying much of anything at all, working through drawer after drawer with a kind of grim, wordless momentum that scared even me while I was doing it. I remember the specific weight of a wet sweater in my hands, how much heavier it got the moment the rain soaked all the way through it, and thinking, distantly, that this was the second time I'd stood in this exact doorway doing this exact thing, and that the repetition itself felt like its own kind of proof. Elena didn't stay quiet through this. She followed me out onto the porch, screaming at me to stop, that I was destroying things that didn't deserve to be destroyed, that throwing her clothes into the rain wasn't going to undo anything or fix anything or prove anything I hadn't already proven to both of us a dozen times over. When I didn't stop, she grabbed the porch's ceramic planter, one we'd had for years, a housewarming gift from her mother, filled with the geraniums she'd replanted every spring since we moved in, and threw it against the porch railing, where it shattered into a dozen pieces across the wet steps, dirt and broken clay, and torn geranium petals scattering into the rain alongside her own scattered clothes. The violence of it seemed to shock her as much as it shocked me. She stood there afterward, breathing hard, staring at the wreckage like she didn't fully recognize the person who'd just thrown it. We stood on that porch for a long time after, both of us soaked, both of us surrounded by broken things, some of them mine, most of them hers, all of it, in some sense ours. Neither of us said anything for almost a full minute. The rain kept coming down steady and cold, running off the porch roof in a thin sheet between us and the yard, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something that had nothing to do with either of us. Then Elena sat down on the wet steps, right in the middle of her own scattered clothes, and started to cry in a way I hadn't heard from her in all 10 years of marriage. Not the composed, controlled crying of the previous confessions, but something rawer, something that seemed to be coming from much further down than the immediate moment. She told me everything then, sitting on those steps in the rain, in a way she hadn't fully managed in any of the previous 3 confessions. She said it started the way it always starts, a bad shift, a moment Ray was simply present for when I wasn't, and a feeling of being truly seen that she hadn't realized she'd been missing until someone finally offered it back to her. She said the first time she ended it, in February, she meant it completely, and the ending itself felt like relief, right up until the next hard shift came, and the loneliness underneath everything reasserted itself exactly the way it always had. She said each attempt to stop had been real, not performance, not manipulation, and each relapse had come from the same well of exhaustion and invisibility she'd never actually addressed, because ending things with Ray had never once fixed the actual hole in the marriage that made Ray feel necessary in the first place. She said the shame lived in specific places she could name precisely. She couldn't look at the family photo on the mantel the week after each relapse, had started physically avoiding that side of the living room, taking the long way around through the kitchen instead. She said she'd realized, sometime around the 3rd ending, sitting in Dr. Alba's office with the tissue box positioned exactly between them, that she didn't know how to want something enough to actually hold on to it once the immediate crisis passed, that the wanting always seemed to fade the moment the fear of losing it did, and that terrified her more than anything else in this whole year had, more than getting caught, more than the marriage ending, more even than what it might do to Julia and Nate. I listened to all of it, soaking wet, sitting on my own front steps surrounded by broken pottery and scattered scrubs. When she finished, I told her I believed every word. I also told her belief wasn't the same as trust, and that I'd run out of trust 3 relapses ago, whether I'd been willing to admit it to myself or not. I filed for divorce 11 days later. Not in anger by that point. The anger had mostly burned itself out on that porch, in the rain, among the wreckage. I filed because I'd finally understood something I should have understood after the 2nd relapse. That loving someone honestly, wanting to forgive them completely, wasn't the same as being able to actually rebuild trust with someone whose pattern had shown itself 4 times in 8 months. Some things aren't about whether you're willing to try again. They're about whether trying again is actually possible anymore. And by June, I knew, with a certainty that didn't waver even in my worst moments of missing her, that it wasn't. The weeks after the porch were quiet in a way the previous cycles never had been. Elena didn't come to me with a 5th ending, a 5th promise. I think, somewhere in the wreckage of that night, something in both of us had finally recognized that we'd reached the end of the version of this we'd both been trying to survive. She moved into her sister Marisol's spare room the following week, calmly, without another scene, and I understood that as its own kind of answer, not a fight to save the marriage, but a quiet acceptance that saving it wasn't a decision either of us could actually make anymore. The divorce went largely in my favor. The house, primary custody of Julia and Nate, with Elena's own attorney advising her not to fight harder than she did, given the documented pattern I'd assembled over those 2 days in June. My legal pad timeline, small and almost embarrassing in its precision, became part of the actual settlement conversation, dates and cycles laid out the same way I'd once laid out a construction schedule, and I remember feeling a strange, hollow kind of vindication watching 2 attorneys discuss the exact numbers I'd written down alone in my garage at 1 in the morning. Elena didn't contest much of it. I think, by the time the papers were finalized, some part of her had reached the same conclusion I had, even if neither of us said so directly. Ray's own marriage didn't survive the fallout either. His wife, Carla, found out, not from me directly, but through the same small world channels that eventually surface everything in a city the size of ours, likely through Priya, though I never confirmed it and didn't especially want to. Carla left within 2 months, taking their own 2 kids with her, a mirror of exactly what had just happened in my own house, playing out in his. I heard, secondhand, that Ray had tried to reach out to Elena once during that stretch, and that she hadn't responded. Whether out of genuine resolve or simple exhaustion with the entire situation, I don't know, and by then it had stopped being something I needed an answer to. Elena lost more than the marriage. She lost, for a long stretch afterward, the version of herself she'd always been known as at work, steady, dependable, the nurse everyone trusted with their worst nights. Because word moves through hospital staff the same way it moves through neighborhoods. And for months, she carried a reputation she hadn't had before, one she spent the 2 years since slowly, quietly rebuilding, according to Marisol, who still updates me occasionally for the kids' sake. I moved forward with Julia and Nate in the house we'd bought together, rebuilding a version of normal that took the better part of a year to actually start feeling steady again. Julia stopped asking why Mommy seemed sad, because Mommy, in her new apartment, in her own separate life, slowly stopped being sad in that particular way. A different kind of steadiness than the one our marriage had offered, but a real one, for both of us, eventually. Nate, younger and more resilient in the specific way small children can be, adjusted to the new schedule of 2 houses faster than either Julia or I expected, though he still, some nights at my place, asks if Mommy is coming to say goodnight, and I've learned to answer that gently, honestly, without making either house sound like a consolation prize. I think often about that first February night, the garbage bags splitting open in the rain, and how much of the year that followed I spent believing each ending was the real one, right up until it wasn't. I understand now that forgiveness isn't actually the hard part of a story like this. The hard part is knowing the difference between forgiving someone and continuing to build your whole life on a foundation that keeps quietly giving way underneath you. I realized something, standing on that porch after the 4th relapse, surrounded by broken pottery neither of us had planned to break. I had spent months treating each promise like a fresh start, when really, every promise was just the next turn of the same wheel, and no amount of my own hope was ever going to be the thing that finally stopped it turning. Only Elena could have done that. For most of that year, she genuinely couldn't, no matter how much she wanted to. I've started dating again, slowly, almost a year out now, in the unhurried way a man rebuilds something after watching a structure fail from a flaw he didn't catch in time. I don't carry the anger from that porch into it. What I carry instead is something closer to a rule I didn't used to have, that a promise, however sincerely meant, isn't the same thing as a pattern, and that the only real evidence of change is what someone actually does across the exact stretch of time they once failed in before. What makes this story different from a single act of betrayal is that Elena's remorse was never fake, and that's precisely what made it so difficult for Marcus to protect himself. A one-time affair gives a person a single moment to judge. A relapsing pattern gives them 4, each one dressed in real tears and real intentions, which means the betrayed partner has to relearn, again and again, that sincerity in the moment doesn't guarantee anything about what happens a week later. The porch scene reveals something the earlier, quieter confrontations couldn't. Both of them, by the 4th cycle, had exhausted the emotional vocabulary for handling this any other way. Marcus's controlled destruction of Elena's belongings wasn't really about the clothes. It was the only language left to him after 3 failed attempts at words. Elena's shattered planter wasn't really about the planter. It was the sound of someone finally hearing, out loud, the full shape of a pattern she'd been unable to see clearly from inside it. There's a harder truth sitting underneath this story too, that Ray was never really the point, for either of them. He was a symptom of a marriage that had quietly hollowed out over 2 years of opposite shifts and unspoken exhaustion, and every time Elena ended it, she was treating the symptom while leaving the actual wound, the loneliness inside her own marriage, completely unaddressed. That's often why relapse patterns like this repeat. The ending removes the person, but never touches the need that made the person necessary in the first place. What ultimately separates this story from simple forgiveness or simple revenge is that Marcus's final decision wasn't driven by anger. It was driven by a colder, more difficult recognition. That 4 documented cycles told him something no single conversation ever could. That trust, once broken this specific number of times, in this specific rhythm, becomes a mathematical fact as much as an emotional one. The legal pad timeline he built wasn't cruelty. It was a man finally trusting evidence over hope, after hope had failed him in the exact same shape 4 times running. Which leaves a question worth sitting with. How many relationships fail not because love disappeared, but because the pattern underneath the love became more powerful than either person's ability to stop it. The thing I still carry from that year isn't the affair itself. It's the 11 good days in June, the longest stretch, the one where I genuinely believed we'd made it through. Losing that particular hope hurt more than any of the discoveries did, because it meant even the best version of our effort together wasn't enough to outlast the pattern underneath it. I don't think Elena is a bad person. I think she was a deeply lonely one, inside a marriage that had gone quiet in ways neither of us fully named until it was already breaking apart. That doesn't undo what happened. It just means the story isn't as simple as villain and victim, even though, for a long time, I badly wanted it to be. If you've ever forgiven someone 4 times, meaning it fully each time, and found yourself standing in the wreckage anyway, you already understand exactly why it took me until that porch, in the rain, surrounded by broken clay and soaked clothes, to finally stop hoping this particular ending would be the real one. Tell me one word in the comments. For a pattern you kept forgiving long after you knew better, or a moment you finally stopped. Thank you for staying with every part of this one tonight.